My name is Carol, and I am 56 years old. And for most of my adult life, I believed that friendship, real friendship, the kind that survives decades, was one of the few things in this world you could actually count on without reservation. I want to start there with that belief because I need you to understand how deeply I held it before I tell you how it was taken apart. Patricia and I had been friends for 22 years. We met in a mommy and me swim class when our daughters were both 18 months old. Two exhausted young mothers sitting on the edge of a lukewarm pool comparing notes on sleep schedules and pediatricians and the particular loneliness of those early parenting years that nobody warns you about. We became inseparable in the way women sometimes become inseparable in their late 20s. Not gradually, but all at once. Like we'd been looking for each other our whole lives without knowing it. 22 years. Our daughters, Emma and Sophie, grew up practically as sisters. We took family vacations together when our husbands could get the same week off work. I was in the hospital waiting room when Patricia's father had his heart attack. She was the one who sat with me holding my hand when I got the call that my mother's cancer had come back for the third and final time. We had our disagreements over the years, of course, every long friendship does, but they were always small, always resolved within a week, always followed by one of us showing up at the other's door with coffee and an apology that didn't need many words because we understood each other that well. Or so I believed. I need to tell you about the lunch because everything that follows makes sense only once you understand what was said at that table and how completely I believed it. It was a Tuesday in early spring. Patricia and I had a standing lunch date every other week at a little cafe near the shopping center we'd been going to for over a decade. The kind of place where the owner knows your order before you sit down. We were talking about nothing in particular the way you do after 22 years of friendship when the conversation drifted, as it sometimes did, to another woman in our social circle, Denise, who had recently had a falling out with someone in our book club over something petty, involving a borrowed casserole dish that had somehow escalated into a months long Cold War. It's just sad, Patricia said, stirring her iced tea. How women our age still do that, talk about each other behind each other's backs. Life's too short for that kind of thing, don't you think? Completely, I agreed. I mean it, she said. And she reached across the table and put her hand over mine the way she'd done 1,000 times over 2 decades. A gesture so familiar it had stopped registering as a gesture at all and had simply become part of the texture of our friendship. You know I'd never talk about you behind your back, Carol. Never. Whatever else happens in this world, that's just not who I am, not with you. I remember smiling and meaning it completely when I said, I know. I feel the exact same way about you. And I did. I want to be very clear about that because I think it matters for what comes later. I was not being naive in some foolish, willfully blind way. I had 22 years of evidence. I had watched Patricia be loyal to me through things that tested loyalty in ways most friendships never get tested, through my divorce scare in my 40s, through a business failure that embarrassed my husband deeply, and that Patricia never once mentioned to another living soul, through a period of postpartum depression after my second daughter that I hadn't even told my own sister about, but had told Patricia sitting on her back porch at 11 at night because I trusted her with the parts of myself I trusted almost no one else with. So when she told me that Tuesday afternoon that she'd never talk about me behind my back, I didn't hear it as a hollow reassurance. I heard it as a simple restatement of a fact I already knew to be true, the way you might reassure someone that the sun would rise tomorrow. We finished lunch. We hugged goodbye in the parking lot the way we always did, and she told me she'd see me Thursday at Sophie's piano recital since our daughters were still close enough, even in their 20s, that we still showed up for each other's kids' milestones. I drove home that afternoon feeling, if anything, a little more secure in my life than I had that morning. 22 years of friendship freshly reaffirmed over iced tea. A husband, Mark, waiting for me at home 30 years into a good marriage. Two daughters I was proud of. A life that, whatever its ordinary difficulties, felt fundamentally solid. I had no idea driving home that afternoon with the windows down and the radio on that in about 6 hours, my younger daughter would hand me her phone across our kitchen table, and everything I thought I understood about that friendship would collapse in the space of about 4 minutes of reading. My daughter Emma is 26. She works in marketing. She's sharp and observant in the way her generation often is about the undercurrents beneath adult social interactions, and she has always had a closer relationship with Sophie, Patricia's daughter, than I fully realized, close enough that the two of them were still in a group chat together, a holdover from high school, one that had apparently expanded over the years to include several other women from our social circle. Some of them my friends, some of them their friends, some of them women I only knew peripherally. That evening, Emma came over for dinner, which she did most Sundays, and she seemed distracted the entire meal, quieter than usual, picking at her food, glancing at her phone in a way that felt less like habit and more like anxiety. I asked her twice if everything was okay. Twice she said yes, a little too quickly. It wasn't until after dinner, after Mark had gone into the den to watch his shows, and it was just the two of us doing dishes, that she finally set down the towel she was holding and said, "Mom, I need to show you something, and I don't know if I should, but I think you need to see it." I remember the particular quality of dread in her voice, the voice of someone who has been carrying something heavy for hours and has finally decided the weight of carrying it alone is worse than the weight of handing it over. She pulled out her phone, opened a group chat, and started scrolling backward through what turned out to be years of messages before finally stopping and handing it to me. "I wasn't looking for this," she said. "I swear, Mom. I was just scrolling for something else and I saw your name, and I couldn't not read it. And then I couldn't stop reading, and the more I read, the worse it got, and I didn't know what to do, whether to tell you or not, but I felt like you deserved to know." I sat down at the kitchen table with her phone in my hand and I started reading. The group chat was called with a casualness that felt almost obscene in retrospect, Girls' Night Crew. I recognized most of the names in the thread, Patricia obviously, but also two other women from our neighborhood, Karen and Beth, both of whom I considered friends, both of whom had been to my house for dinner more times than I could count, and Sophie herself, along with two of Sophie's college friends. I'd met a handful of times at family events over the years. The first message that caught my eye was from Patricia, dated almost 4 years earlier. It read, "Carol just told me she's worried Mark's pulling away emotionally, lol. Girl needs to work on herself instead of blaming him for everything. Some people never learn." I stared at that sentence for a long moment, feeling something drop away inside me, slow and heavy like a stone sinking through water. I recognized the conversation she was referencing. It had happened during a genuinely difficult period in my marriage, a period when Mark had been distant and withdrawn following his father's death, a period when I had gone to Patricia specifically because I trusted her scared and vulnerable, asking for advice, asking for reassurance, asking essentially for the kind of support you ask a best friend for when your marriage feels shaky and you don't know who else to turn to. She had held my hand across that same cafe table. She had told me my feelings were valid, that Mark was lucky to have me, that we would get through it. And apparently, sometime shortly after she had turned around and reduced my private fear, the most vulnerable thing I had told her in months, into a punchline for an audience of 5 other women, most of whom I considered friends. I kept scrolling. Emma sat next to me, not saying anything, watching my face with an expression I now recognize as guilt. Not guilt for showing me, I understand now, but guilt for the years she'd apparently half noticed things in that chat over time and never quite put together how bad it actually was until she sat down and read it. Start to finish that afternoon, there were more, so many more. A message about my weight from 2 summers earlier, after I'd mentioned at a dinner party that I was trying a new eating plan. Carol's diet. Again, LOL. This is like the fifth one this year. At some point, you have to just accept some people aren't going to change. A message mocking a dress I'd worn to Karen's 50th birthday party, a dress I had actually agonized over, had asked Patricia's opinion on before buying, had felt genuinely good in that night. Did anyone else see what Carol wore last night? Lamau, bless her heart, someone needs to tell her that color is not doing her any favors at our age. A message from just 8 months earlier discussing a small dinner I had hosted one. I had put real effort into using my late mother's china for the first time since she passed. Carol's dinner parties are so try hard, it's kind of sad, honestly. She's still doing the whole perfect hostess thing like it's 2005. I want to describe what it feels like to read messages like this because I think it's different from other kinds of betrayal, and I think it's important for anyone listening who has been through something similar to hear it named accurately. It is not like the sharp singular pain of catching a spouse in an affair. It is slower and stranger than that. It is the specific horror of realizing that a version of yourself you never knew existed. A version built entirely out of your most vulnerable moments, twisted and flattened into cruelty. A version discussed and laughed at by a rotating cast of women you called friends has been living an entire separate life for years in a place you never had access to. Every dinner party I had hosted with genuine care. Every vulnerable conversation I'd had with Patricia during hard seasons of my marriage. Every outfit I'd asked her honest opinion on, trusting her honesty. All of it apparently had a shadow version. A version that existed in this group chat narrated by the person I trusted most outside my own family for the entertainment of women I had fed dinner to in my own home. I don't know how long I sat there reading. Long enough that Mark eventually wandered back into the kitchen, saw my face, and asked what was wrong, and I couldn't even answer him at first. Emma answered for me quietly, and I watched my husband's expression shift from confusion to a controlled, simmering anger I hadn't seen on him in years, not since his own father decades earlier. Had said something cruel about me at a family gathering, and Mark had defended me so fiercely it had caused a rift in his family for almost a year. How far back does this go? I finally asked Emma. She looked down at her hands. I stopped counting after a while, Mom, but some of the earliest ones I've found were from almost 6 years ago. 6 years. 6 years of a friendship I believed completely was one of the most solid things in my life, running in parallel with an entirely separate performance of that same friendship, one designed for an audience I never knew was watching. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Mark in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and around 2 a.m., unable to lie still any longer. I got up, went downstairs, and asked Emma, who was staying over, if she would help me go through the entire chat, start to finish, so I could understand exactly what I was dealing with before I did anything at all. She agreed. We sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of decaf and her phone between us, and over the next 3 hours, we built what I can only describe as an archaeological record of a friendship's secret second life. I learned things that night I don't think I will ever fully stop carrying. I learned that Patricia had at various points over 6 years discussed with the group the details of my mother's illness and death in a tone that framed my grief as excessive and attention seeking. Carol's still bringing up her mom at every dinner I get. It's sad, but it's been 2 years. Some people milk it. The specifics of a miscarriage I'd had in my early 40s, which I had told exactly 3 people in my life, one of whom was apparently now discussing it with an audience of 6. Remember when Carol had that whole meltdown about the pregnancy thing? I felt so bad for Mark, honestly, having to deal with that. And perhaps most devastatingly, an ongoing thread of commentary about my younger daughter, Emma herself, the very person now sitting across from me holding the phone, mocking Emma's choice of college major, her early struggles finding a job after graduation, even. In one message, I made Emma reread twice because I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing, a comment about Emma's weight during a period in her early 20s when I knew privately my daughter had struggled with her body image in ways she'd only recently opened up to me about. I watched Emma's face when we reached that message. I watched 26 years of assuming Aunt Patricia, as she'd always called her, was a genuine, if slightly distant family friend collapse into something much colder and much more clear eyed. She used to bring me birthday presents, Emma said quietly, staring at the screen. Every single year, I thought she actually cared about me. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't entirely. What became clear over those 3 hours of reading was that this was not a friend who occasionally vented in a private moment of weakness, something I think most of us could if we're honest. Forgive, because venting is human, and even good friends sometimes need to complain about each other in ways that aren't meant to be cruel, just human and imperfect. This was something different. This was consistent, ongoing, almost recreational cruelty sustained across 6 years. Apparently functioning as a kind of entertainment, a running bit essentially, with me as the unknowing subject performed for an audience that included 2 other women I called friends, and my own daughter's peer group. I also began to understand something else. Reading carefully, Patricia was not simply venting to strangers. She was performing specifically for status within that group. Nearly every cruel message she sent was met with laughing emojis, with other women adding their own commentary, egging her on. And Patricia's messages seemed to escalate in cruelty specifically in response to that positive reinforcement. The crueler she was, the more the group engaged, and the more the group engaged, the crueler her next comment became. I realized, sitting at my own kitchen table at 4 in the morning, watching 6 years of evidence that my best friend had been building social capital with other women over time, using my private vulnerabilities as currency. There was one more thing I found that night near the very end of the chat, dated only 3 weeks earlier, after I noted with a kind of numb precision a phone call where I had confided in Patricia about a health scare. I'd had a suspicious mammogram result that had turned out, thankfully, to be nothing but that had terrified me for the 11 days between the initial scan and the follow up biopsy. I had called Patricia in tears during those 11 days. She had talked me through it, told me she loved me, told me she'd be right there with me at the follow up appointment if I wanted her there. The message in the group chat sent 40 minutes after that phone call read, Carol's convinced she has cancer again. LOL. She does this every few years. Remember the lump thing in 2021? That was nothing, too. Some people just need the drama, I swear. I set the phone down on the table at that point and didn't pick it back up again that night. Emma reached across the table and took my hand, the same gesture Patricia had made across a different table only days earlier, and for a moment, I almost laughed, a strange, broken, humorless laugh at how similar the gesture was and how differently it now felt coming from my daughter instead. What are you going to do? Emma asked. I sat with that question for a long time before I answered. I don't know yet, I finally said, but I'm not going to do anything tonight. Whatever this is going to become, it's not going to start out of exhaustion and rage at 4 in the morning. If I'm going to say something, I want to say it right. I did not sleep for most of that week, and I did not, as I'd promised Emma, do anything rash. What I did instead over the following 4 days was something that surprised even me. I read the entire chat again methodically this time, taking notes on my phone the way I might have organized information for a work presentation decades earlier when I'd still had a career outside the home. I wanted to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with before I did anything that couldn't be undone. I identified who had participated actively, Patricia overwhelmingly, but also Karen to a lesser but still significant degree, and Beth, who had mostly just used laughing reaction emojis without adding much text of her own, which felt in its own way almost as unsettling since it meant she had sat silently reading these things about me for years without ever once in 6 years saying a word to me or apparently feeling enough discomfort to leave the conversation. I identified the timeline when it had started, which appeared to coincide uncomfortably with a period when Patricia's own marriage had been going through serious difficulty, and I now suspected when comparing herself unfavorably to what she perceived as my more stable life might have created a resentment I had never once picked up on in 22 years of what I believed was total honesty between us. And I decided after those 4 days of careful reading that I was not going to confront this the way my first instinct, the 4 in the morning instinct, had wanted to. I was not going to call Patricia screaming. I was not going to show up at her house in tears demanding an explanation. Both of those responses I understood would allow her to control the narrative, to frame my hurt as an overreaction to apologize in exactly the careful, minimizing way people apologize when they're caught but not truly sorry. I'm so sorry that was taken out of context. We were just venting. You know how girl talk can get. I never meant anything by it. I wanted something different. I wanted her to sit for a while in uncertainty. I wanted her to understand that I knew without immediately knowing how much I knew or what I intended to do about it. So 4 days after Emma showed me the screenshots, I sent Patricia exactly one text message. It read, I read the girls' night crew chat, all of it, 6 years worth. I'm not ready to talk to you yet, and I don't know when I will be. But I wanted you to know that I know, rather than let you keep sitting across from me thinking you got away with it. I sent it, put my phone on airplane mode, and went for a 2 hour walk by myself because I understood that whatever came back in response, I did not want to receive it standing still, waiting anxiously for validation from the very person who'd spent 6 years mocking my anxiety behind my back. When I turned my phone back on that evening, I had 11 missed calls from Patricia and a string of increasingly frantic texts escalating from, Carol, please call me, I can explain, to, please, this isn't what it looks like, I love you, please don't do anything before we talk, to finally a message that told me everything I needed to know about how she understood the situation. Please don't tell anyone else about this, please. We can work through this privately. It doesn't need to become a whole thing. I noticed reading that final message that at no point in 11 calls and 9 texts had she actually denied any of it. Not once did she say it's not true or those messages are being misread. Every single response was about damage control, about keeping it private, about managing my reaction, about protecting herself from a wider consequence rather than about the actual content of what she'd done for 6 years. That told me something important. It told me she wasn't sorry for what she'd said. She was sorry only that I had found out. Over the following 2 weeks, I did something I suspect surprised everyone who eventually heard this story, including my own husband. I didn't cut Patricia off immediately. I didn't tell our wider circle of mutual friends what I'd found. Instead, I quietly, carefully gathered a little more information. I asked Emma gently if she knew of other messages, other instances, anything else that might be relevant. I found out through a conversation with Beth's own daughter, who happened to mention something in passing that made my stomach drop, that Patricia had apparently told a version of the story of my postpartum depression. The one deeply private thing I had only ever told Patricia sitting on her back porch at 11 at night, 20 some years earlier, to at least one person outside our friend group entirely years earlier, framing it, according to what Beth's daughter had heard secondhand, as evidence that I'd always been a little unstable. By the time I had gathered everything I felt I needed, I understood I was no longer dealing with a friend who had made a mistake, or even a friend who had a pattern of occasional venting that had gotten out of hand. I was dealing with someone who had, for reasons rooted in her own insecurities that I would never fully understand, built an entire ongoing relationship with cruelty toward me as one of its central features while presenting an entirely different face to me directly. For over 2 decades, I decided I was not going to let that stand quietly. But I also was not going to handle it the way she'd begged me to, privately contained, swept under a rug for the sake of everyone's comfort but mine. I was invited 2.5 weeks after sending that first text to our neighborhood book club's monthly meeting. The same book club made up largely of the same women who appeared throughout that group chat, including Patricia, Karen, and Beth. I decided that was where this was going to end, publicly, calmly, and on my terms. I want to say before I describe what happened that night that I did not go to that book club meeting planning to create a scene for its own sake. I am not by nature a dramatic person. I had spent 56 years up to that point generally avoiding conflict, generally giving people the benefit of the doubt, generally being, I understand, now looking back, exactly the kind of trusting, non confrontational person who makes an easy, long term target for someone who wants an audience for cruelty and a friend too kind to ever suspect it. But I had also spent 2.5 weeks thinking very carefully about what I wanted the outcome of this to be, and I had decided that the outcome I wanted was not revenge in any petty sense. I wanted truth spoken clearly in front of the same audience that had spent 6 years laughing along in private. 7 women were present that evening at Karen's house where the book club met that month myself. Patricia, Karen, Beth, and 3 other women from the neighborhood who, as far as I knew, had no involvement in the group chat at all. We had barely gotten through 15 minutes of surface level small talk about the book, something none of us, I suspect, were particularly focused on that night. Given the tension radiating visibly off both Patricia and me when I set my wine glass down and asked if I could say something before we got further into the discussion, I want to tell all of you something. I said, because some of you already know part of it, and I think the rest of you deserve to understand why the mood in this room has felt strange for the last 20 minutes. I watched Patricia's face go pale. Karen looked down at her hands. Beth's expression was harder to read, somewhere between guilt and genuine surprise, and I understood watching her that she perhaps hadn't fully grasped until that moment how serious this was about to become. 3 weeks ago, I continued, my daughter showed me a group chat. Some of you have been in it for years, girls' night crew. I read all of it. 6 years of messages going back to conversations I had privately with Patricia during some of the hardest moments of my life: my mother's death, a miscarriage, a health scare that terrified me, struggles in my marriage that I trusted her with because I believed completely that trust between us went both ways. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that because I think it mattered in that room that I stayed steady. Shouting would have let this become about my anger instead of about what had actually happened. I wanted it to be about what had actually happened. I'm not here tonight to humiliate anyone, I said, looking specifically at Patricia now. I'm here because for 6 years, I trusted you completely, Patricia, and 3 weeks ago, you sat across from me at lunch and told me you'd never talk about me behind my back. And I believed you, the way I've believed you for 22 years. I think the people in this room deserve to understand what kind of friend they've actually had, because I certainly wish someone had told me. Patricia started to speak the beginning I could already tell from the shape of her mouth of an explanation involving context, involving venting, involving how these things get taken out of proportion, and I held up my hand gently and said something I had specifically prepared in advance because I knew she would try to explain and I knew I needed to close that door before it opened. I'm not asking for an explanation tonight, I said. I read every message myself. There's no context that changes what 6 years of that looks like. I'm not here for an apology either, honestly, because I don't think what I'd hear right now would be a real one. I think it would be an apology for getting caught, not an apology for what you did. I'm here because I've spent 22 years being the kind of friend who tells the truth even when it's uncomfortable, and I wanted for once for the truth to be told about me instead of around me. The room was silent for what felt like a very long time. Then one of the 3 women who hadn't been part of the chat, a woman named Ruth, who I didn't know especially well, but who had always struck me as thoughtful, said quietly, Carol, I'm so sorry. That's an awful thing to find out. Thank you for having the courage to say it out loud instead of just letting it sit. That more than anything, Patricia eventually managed to stammer out a mixture of tears and half apologies and repeated insistences that it wasn't as bad as it looked out of context, which of course only confirmed in real time exactly what I'd predicted she'd say was, the moment I understood I had done the right thing in the right way at the right time. I didn't stay much longer after that. I finished my glass of wine. I told Karen the book had been a difficult read for me this month for reasons that had nothing to do with the writing. And I left driving home in a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in 3 weeks. Not happy, not triumphant, but settled in a way I hadn't been since the night Emma first handed me her phone. It has been 9 months since that night at Karen's house, and I want to tell you honestly what the aftermath has looked like, because I think it's more complicated and more useful than a simple story of victory over betrayal. Patricia and I are not friends anymore. She reached out several times in the weeks that followed, first with lengthy texts trying to explain, then with a handwritten letter that arrived at my house that I read once and did not respond to, then eventually with silence, which I think was in its own way the most honest thing she'd offered me in the entire ordeal. There is no repairing 22 years of friendship once you understand that 6 of those years ran alongside a parallel, cruel shadow version of the same relationship. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, though. I certainly felt bitterness for a long time. I say it simply as a fact I've made peace with. Karen and I have slowly, carefully rebuilt something not quite what we had before, but something honest. She came to me privately about a month after the book club incident and told me she'd participated in that chat out of what she now understood was a kind of insecure need to feel included. That she genuinely hadn't understood in the moment how much cruelty had accumulated until she saw it laid out all at once in the silence of that room. I believe her mostly, though our friendship carries a slightly different weight now, a little more careful, a little less unguarded than it used to be. I'm not sure that's entirely a bad thing. Beth and I are cordial when our paths cross, but we're not close anymore, and I don't think we ever will be again. Some breaches I've learned aren't about a single dramatic betrayal. They're about years of silent complicity of sitting quietly in a room while someone else is torn down, and I found when I really examined my own heart that I couldn't fully separate that kind of silence from the cruelty itself. Emma and I are closer than we've ever been. I think showing me that chat was one of the hardest things she's ever done, and I've told her many times since how grateful I am that she trusted me enough and trusted our relationship enough to hand me something so painful. Instead of quietly protecting me from it, we talk more openly now about harder things, precisely because of what that night taught both of us about the cost of not knowing. I found a new group of women over these 9 months, mostly through a grief support group I joined initially to process my mother's death and ended up staying in long after the official reason for attending had passed. There is a particular kind of honesty among women who meet each other for the first time, already carrying something heavy, none of the decades of accumulated performance. None of the careful management of image that I now understand had crept quietly into my older friendships without my ever noticing it happening. People sometimes ask me when I tell this story whether I regret confronting Patricia the way I did publicly in front of others rather than privately, the way she'd begged me to. I tell them no without hesitation. I think privacy in that specific situation would only have protected her, not me. 6 years of cruelty performed for an audience I came to believe deserved a resolution that included that same audience, not for revenge, but because the people who had laughed along deserved to sit with what that laughter had actually cost someone they called a friend. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've thought about it a great deal over these 9 months, I think it's this: the words someone says to your face are not always the truest measure of a relationship. Loyalty isn't proven in the moments when someone is looking at you holding your hand across a table, telling you they'd never betray your trust. It's proven in the room you're not in the version of you that exists when you're not there to defend yourself. I spent 22 years measuring my friendship with Patricia by what she said to my face, and I was wrong for all 6 of the years that a very different version of that friendship was living quietly in a phone I never had access to. I don't say that to make anyone listening suspicious of every friend in their life. Most friendships, I still believe, are exactly what they appear to be. But I do say it because I think somewhere in the back of my mind, I had always assumed loyalty was self evident, that 22 years of history was itself a kind of proof. It isn't. And I would rather know that painful truth now at 56 with the people I have left in my life, who've earned the version of trust I used to give away too easily, than spend another 6 years believing in a friendship that only existed in the room I happened to be standing in.